What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to The Common Coder. My name is Josh, and in this video, I'm going to be showing you how to install and configure ESLint so that you can write clean and error-free JavaScript code. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so before we get started, there are a couple prerequisites in order to follow along with this video. The first thing that you'll need is to make sure that you've installed Node.js because it's required in order to run ESLint. The next thing that you'll want is to make sure that you've installed Visual Studio Code. And I put a little asterisk here because you could probably follow along without Visual Studio Code, but I'm going to be using it to edit my JavaScript files so that we can test out the linter. So you can use whatever editor that you want. However, I'm going to be using VS Code in this video. And the last thing, since we're going to be working with JavaScript, you'll probably want to have some familiarity with JavaScript. So that way you know what the syntax looks like and how to work with the language. And that way you can see the errors that ESLint is trying to help us out with. All right, so what exactly is ESLint? Well, as the name would suggest, it is a linter. And what a linter helps us do is identify and fix problems in our code, and in this case, specifically JavaScript code. So the ES stands for ECMAScript, of which JavaScript conforms to the ECMAScript standard. And again, what the linter does is helps us identify and fix potential problems in our code before they become problems in production. So one of the downsides of a language like JavaScript, since it doesn't go through any compilation process, it's a little harder to find and fix errors before those errors go out into production. So a linter will help us out with that. It also helps to make sure that our code is consistent and error-free, and that it's also easy to read and maintain. So you can think of it as a style guide of sorts. So a style guide is basically an agreed upon set of rules for the code that a team is maintaining. And so ESLint can help us basically get those rules enforced at the code level and at the tooling level. And that way, when it comes to things like code reviews, we can make sure that all of the code conforms to the styles that we've specified. One of the key benefits of ESLint is that it's extensible. So in addition to the default functionality, you can add additional functionality to it by downloading various plugins or even writing your own plugins to support different frameworks and libraries such as React or Angular or Vue, for example. One other cool feature is that ESLint is shareable, and so the configurations that you write, you can actually share those. Maybe you have multiple repositories and you want to have a consistent configuration across all those repositories. You can create your own config, and then you can share that in the form of what's called a preset. Now, there are some very popular presets. There's a standard preset provided by ESLint itself, and there's some other ones by companies that you probably have heard of, like Airbnb, that have adopted specific configurations for their code and then have shared those configurations with the developer community. So just helps everybody get on the same page and make sure the various rules that you've set up are being enforced across your entire code base. All right, and with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at how we install and configure ESLint. All right, so in order to install ESLint, we're first going to head over to the ESLint official website, which is at ESLint.org. And what we really care about, at least as of right now, is going to be this command here, which is going to allow us to install ESLint into a project of ours. And so for us to do that, we need to go ahead and create a project. Now, ESLint can be installed globally, or it can be installed at the project level. And I'm always going to recommend installing it at the project level. That way you can make sure that each project has its own specific version of ESLint and its own specific config. If your project happens to be inheriting an ESLint config or the ESLint settings from the global level, it can be a little difficult to figure out where your errors are coming from in that case. So I always recommend using a locally installed version instead of the global one. So that's what we're going to do now. But in order for us to do that, we need to first create a project. And what we'll do is go ahead and cd into my code directory, which is where I like to keep all my projects. And I'm going to go ahead and make a project using the make dir command. And I'll call this ESLint tutorial. All right, and then I'm going to cd into the ESLint tutorial directory. And then what I'm going to do is go ahead and initialize this as a new NPM project. So one of the things that we're going to need to do is install ESLint into our project. And in order to do that, it needs to be an NPM-based project, which essentially means that it has a package.json file that can keep track of our dependencies. So let's go ahead and initialize this real quick. We'll say npm init-y, and that will basically create a stub package.json, which I can then add to as needed. But what I'm going to do now is go ahead and open this up in Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to say code dot. All right, and so now I am in my project directory, and we can see my package.json file. So I'm going to go back over into my terminal, and we're still in the same folder. So ESLint tutorial. ESLint tutorial. And now what we want to do is go ahead and run this command npm init @ESLint/config@latest. And so this will download and install the latest version of ESLint and the latest version of the config into my project. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this out the way I don't have to type it. Go ahead and clear the terminal to give us a little bit more space. And again, it's going to be npm init @ESLint/config@latest. So it's a little bit of a mouthful. Recommend just using the copy button over here and copying it. That way you don't have a typo. So I'm going to go ahead and hit return. And what this actually does is gives us a command line interface to configure ESLint. So it's a little bit different than older tutorials that you might find on the internet. This really gives you the opportunity to configure your installation up front and not to have to do everything manually. But as we'll see, basically just sets up some boilerplate for us on the back end, which we're going to check out in just a minute when we're done. So it's asking me, how do I want to use ESLint? Do I want to use it to check the syntax only or to check the syntax and find problems? So depending on your answer to this question, it's going to set up and configure things a little bit differently. And so we want the full power of ESLint to check our syntax and find problems. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter here. And then it's asking me, what type of modules does your project use? So this is where that knowledge of JavaScript is going to come into play. And basically, if your code consists of import and export statements, so maybe you're using front end like React, or you're using JavaScript modules on the back end, if you're able to use import and export, you're going to want to use JavaScript modules. If you're using an older version of Node and you're using require statements, things like that, basically in CommonJS format, you're going to want to go ahead and select the CommonJS here. If you're just using it and you just have a collection of JavaScript files that you want to check with ESLint, that's totally fine too. You'll just click none of these. All right, so in our case, we'll probably end up using JavaScript modules. So I'm going to go ahead and hit return here. Then it's asking me, what framework does my project use? So depending on what you're doing, if you're using React, you'll want to select that. Otherwise, go ahead and select none of these. And then it asks if your project uses TypeScript. So TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript that compiles down into JavaScript. So if you're not using TypeScript, go ahead and select no here. And then it's asking me, where does my code run? Is it running in the browser or is it running in Node, basically on the server? You'll also need to press space when you select this. So it's a select Node. I can actually have it run in both the browser and Node, or both. In this case, I'm just going to select Node and use the space bar to check and uncheck these. And then it says the config that you've selected requires the following dependencies. So it's going to download ESLint at version 9x, so whatever the latest version is. It's going to download globals, and it's going to download ESLint/JS. So basically all of these questions it's asking you is trying to figure out what pieces of ESLint it needs to install. And that way it takes the burden of you setting it up manually more or less out of the picture. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is select yes to install these. It's going to ask which package manager that we're using. We're using npm, but if you're using anything else, if you're using yarn or pnpm, you can go ahead and select those. I'm going to select npm, and it's going to go ahead and install our dependencies. And if we jump back over to VS Code, we'll be able to see what it did. So if we look at our package.json, it downloaded ESLint. It downloaded ESLint/JS. So this is the JavaScript implementation of ESLint. So like I said, the ES stands for ECMAScript. So we specifically want JavaScript support since JavaScript is a flavor of ECMAScript. And then it also downloads this globals, and this is basically just global identifiers from different JavaScript environments. All right, and then we can see if we go into the ESLint configuration file, what it has done is import the globals from globals, and then imports the JavaScript plugin for ESLint. And then it sets up the configuration so that way our language options uses the node globals, so it knows what those are. So globals.node. If we take a look at the globals documentation, you'll see there's other things for other environments like browser. So in that case, it would be globals.browser. And then we can see that it also is using this JavaScript plugin. So plugin js.configs.recommended. So it's the recommended configuration for JavaScript. And then on top of that, we can start customizing and changing our rules if we choose to do so. All right, the last thing that we want to do here is go back into this package.json file, and we want to go ahead and add a script to our scripts section here. So that way we can run ESLint using an npm command. So what we'll do is go ahead and add a lint script. So don't forget your comma here since this is JSON, and we'll go ahead and call this lint, and this is just going to run ESLint. All right, now we can go ahead and try this out. If we jump back to the terminal, I'm gonna go ahead and say npm run lint. And you can see that it ran the ESLint command. And since I don't have any JavaScript files, we don't see any output here. So let's go ahead and fix that. Let's go ahead and add a JavaScript file and see how we can configure our ESLint rules in order to report back on any potential issues inside of our code. All right, so what I'm going to do here is go ahead and create an index.js file for us to write some code in. So I'll call this index.js. And then what I'm going to do is go ahead and create a new variable, and I'll go ahead and call this hello. And I'll go ahead and set this equal to hello. All right, so we have a variable declaration of hello with the value of hello as a string. So far, our code looks good, but let's go ahead and see what happens if we run the linter. So if I say npm run lint, which runs that npm command, you can see that I actually have an error. And it's telling me that hello is assigned a value, but that value is never used anywhere in my code. Now this wouldn't necessarily cause a problem, but you are creating a variable, you are taking up extra space in the computer's memory that's actually not using at all. And so for us to have the best, most optimal code we can have, a linter can help us find these types of issues and then fix them before they could become potential problems. So this is a relatively simple example, but you might be asking yourself, where does this rule come from and how do we configure these rules or even turn these rules on or off? So if we go back to ESLint and click on this Get Started button, we can scroll down a little bit here and we can see some information about the rules and the configuration. Down here it says that your ESLint config will also include a recommended configuration, which is that JS configs recommended. And what this does is it turns on all of the recommended rules that are here on the rules page by default. So if we check out this rules page, we can take a look at all of the various rules that we can turn on or off, and anything marked with this green check mark, you can see up here at the top, it says it's using the recommended config from ESLint/JS in a configuration file that enables this rule. And so like we mentioned earlier in the video, that is a shareable config of recommended rules that is being applied to our project by default. Now, if we took that out, all of the rules would be off by default and we'd have to turn on the ones that we want to use. So for example, if we jump back to VS Code and let's go ahead and just comment out this recommended rule. If I go ahead and run ESLint again, you can see now that I no longer have any errors in my project. So that is the real value of having a shareable config. You can basically inherit these rules by default. And this is just one example. There's other pre-made configs that various companies use. Like I said, one of the most common ones being the Airbnb config, which is a pre-configured set of rules that are agreed on by the developers at Airbnb. And you can download that config and use them inside of your own project. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and uncomment this config recommended, and let's take a look and see what we can do to change some of these rules. So here, for example, if we run ESLint one more time, so I'm gonna say npm run lint, you can see that our hello variable is assigned, but it's never used. Let's just say I want to throw a warning instead of having this error. So usually your build tools, if it encounters an error like this from a linter, it will stop your build and you'll have to fix the problem before you can build and deploy your project. So what if we want the developers on our team to make sure that, they don't leave any of these unassigned variables laying around, but we want to warn them instead of having the whole build process fail. So we can do that by overriding the rule. And so what we can do is go ahead and find that rule inside of the config. So let's go ahead and see, this is the no unused vars. So here's the no unused vars rule. We can go ahead and click on this and you can see this gives us some rule details, gives us some examples of where this rule will be enforced. If we keep scrolling down all the way to the bottom, we can see the various options for no unused vars. So at a high level, we add this rules object into our config and then we reference the rule name and then we can tell it what to do, whether we want it off, whether we want it to error, or whether we want it to warn. And then there's these extra configurations where you can have it specify to certain types of variables. So we do variables all, or we can specifically check only locally declared variables and allow global variables to be unused. So if you're creating a library of variables that you want to allow other code to have access to, you're not going to want that rule on for global variables. So lots of different configurations that you can read about here. So let's go ahead and just at the very basic level, go ahead and set no unused vars to warn instead of error. And if we go back, we can see back on the main page here in the configuration, we can either turn the rule off, we can set it to warn, or we can set it to error. And by doing so, we can either use the words or we can use 0 for off, 1 for warn, or 2 for error. All right, so if we jump back into the config, we can go ahead and configure our rules here. And if you notice, this export default is an array. First piece of the array is our language options that sets up our globals. The second one is the plugin for the recommended config. And then we're going to go ahead and add into this another object that is going to configure our rules. All right, and that rules is an object. And what we do is specify the name of the rule as the key. So this is going to be no unused vars. And then the value can either be an array like we saw in the documentation, or a single string value unless you're going to provide some additional config. So in this case, we are going to keep it simple and go ahead and set the no unused vars to warn instead of error. And now we can see if we go back into our terminal, if we run npm run lint, we can see that now we get a warning. So if we were going to run this through some kind of build tool and we allowed warnings inside of the build tool, we could still report on the errors and let the developers know, hey, you have something that you need to fix here, but we can allow the build process to continue. So we get some flexibility in terms of how we want to enforce these rules inside of our code base. Again, we can go ahead and turn this off. So if I use the word off here and then go ahead and run npm run lint again, now you can see that we don't have any errors. All right, you can see that if we jump back to the ESLint documentation and we check out the rules page, we can see all of the various rules that are enforced by default, as well as the documentation for each one of those rules if we want to go ahead and overwrite them. So you can see anything with this check mark is going to be part of the recommended config. And if you notice, there's also this wrench here, which allows some problems that are reported by this rule to automatically be fixable by adding the -- fix command. And basically what this does, if you notice, a lot of these don't have the wrench, but for certain things, ESLint can fix your code for you. So for example, in this arrow body style, it says require braces around arrow function bodies. With an arrow function, if you can have an implicit return where you don't have to actually provide braces and you can just return whatever the value is. So let's go ahead and see an example of this. So this arrow body style, I'm gonna go ahead and turn this rule on. So if we jump back to VS Code for our rules here, let's go ahead and set that to warn. And then our other rule for the arrow functions, it's gonna be arrow body style. We're gonna go ahead and say arrow body style. So if we look at the ESLint documentation for arrow body style, we can see that this rule takes one or two options. The first is a string, which can be always, as needed, or never. So slightly different options in this case. And then you can also use an array for more fine-grained configuration, where in this case, we can error always, or we can error when the case is as needed or never. So we can really kind of customize the way we want this to work. And so we can see some examples of this. In this case of always, we can error always. And we can see that in these specific cases, like let foo return 0, in this case, we technically don't need curly braces here. So down here, if we look at as needed, you can see that in these specific cases, we actually don't need to use the curly braces here because omitting them is perfectly valid JavaScript syntax in this case. But there are scenarios where you can't do that, and ESLint will help us catch those errors as well. So what we're gonna go ahead and do in this case is set it to error always. So let's go ahead and go back to Visual Studio Code, change this to an array, and we'll say error always. All right, and so what this does and what this means is if I create another variable and I say let hello function equal, and then we're gonna make this an arrow function, and this will just console.log hello. And so if we don't have more than one line, we can do this shorthand function where the function body sits on the same line and whatever is in here is either returned or executed. So in this case, if I run hello function, it's going to log out the word hello to the terminal. And with my ESLint rule, it's basically saying, no, you're not allowed to do this. You need to specifically put the contents of your function inside of curly braces. And now if I run the linter again, you can see that I have two problems, one error and one warning. One error potentially fixable with the -- fix option. So how do we use that -- fix option? So if you remember, when we set up our package.json, we set up this lint script that runs ESLint. So that's actually the same as running npx, which is the command used to run executables downloaded by Node.js. So in this case, ESLint is an executable that we can run. So npx ESLint. Now in this case, if I want to run the -- fix, I can do that same thing. And I can say npx ESLint -- fix. And notice how I only get the warning now. And if I look at my code, you can see that it has added the curly braces around my function body here. All right, so I'm gonna undo that change and go ahead and click save. And what I'm gonna do is go into my package.json and add another script here just in case I ever want to lint and fix at the same time. So I'll say lint :fix, and that will run the ESLint command with the -- fix option. All right, and this is only possible on rules that have this little wrench highlighted here. So all these other ones where it's grayed out, those ones aren't able to be automatically fixed by the linter, but any one of these rules that has the wrench, ESLint will do its best to try to fix those errors for you if you pass that -- fix option. All right, so one more thing I want to point out here on the rules page is that if you take a look at the table of contents over here on the right, you'll see this section here that says layout and formatting. If we go ahead and click on this, we'll see that there's only one rule inside of this layout and formatting. So over the years, other tooling for helping with layout and formatting have emerged, and ESLint has essentially just become a tool to help check for errors in your code and to not necessarily concern itself with layout and formatting issues. So there's ongoing debates whether you should use single quotes or double quotes. There's ongoing debates whether you should use tabs or spaces. Those are really layout and formatting concerns. They don't have anything to do with the way your JavaScript codes actually runs. And so for that reason, a lot of the older rules that are specifically related to layout and formatting have been deprecated. So if you take a look at some of these older deprecated rules, you can see that things like indent, this is deprecated. Basically, that's a layout and formatting issue. The JavaScript interpreter doesn't really care if your code's indented or not, so this rule has been deprecated. Now, if you do care about that in your code base, and you should because it helps with more readable, maintainable code, you want to check out something like Prettier, which has a similar rule-based system to ESLint and allows you to configure the way you want your code formatted, and you can even set it up so that way, you can format your code on save and make sure that your code in your code base is very clean and maintainable and easy to read. All right, and the other thing that I want to point out is inside of VS Code. So if you are using VS Code, there's an extension available, which is called ESLint, and it's an official extension from Microsoft. Now I have it disabled in my editor because I wanted to show you how to use it in the command line, but I'll be doing a separate video on how to use this ESLint extension inside of VS Code. So if you would like to see that video on how to use this extension, I would definitely recommend subscribing and hitting that notification bell so that way you can be notified when that upload happens. And with that, we have learned how to install and configure ESLint for any JavaScript project that you might be working on. All right, that is pretty much going to conclude our tutorial on how to install and configure ESLint. If you like this video and found this information valuable, please leave a like down below, and if you're new here, please consider subscribing. We're going to be covering more about web development, including JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, and everything else in between. So if that's what you're into, I would love to have you along for the journey. All right, well, until next time, be sure to stay curious, never stop learning, and I will see you all in the next video.